I think the lack of resolution in Azula's narrative, or at least lack of resolution that is wholly satisfying, leads to this fascination with her. And when I say a lack of wholly satisfying resolution, I want to be clear, I'm not saying that as a criticism of the show. I think the tragic downfall of Azula is one of the most poignant and affecting storylines in the entire show. It's great tragedy in the sense that a character fundamentally suffers because of their own ambitions and their own faults, but nonetheless, this suffering, while inevitable and right with the basic innate order of all things, is not joyous. It doesn't strike one as simple poetic justice. There's a sense of sorrow in that loss, even as it seems inevitable. That's what a good tragedy should be. A bad person winning strikes us as unjust. A good person winning or a bad person being punished strikes us as natural and perfectly acceptable and perfectly right and comforting and reassuring. A person who is good in many ways but deeply flawed, who destroys their own life because of traits that are buried deep within their character, strikes us as tragic. A villainous character who nonetheless is compelling and interesting and capable of some degree of thoughtfulness and consideration of others, fundamentally relinquishing the opportunity of improvement and falling victim to their own vices, nourished by a corrupt and unjust world that shaped them, that also strikes us as tragic. And the latter is what we have with Azula. She's the only real character in Avatar: The Last Airbender where this is the case. In the side of the heroes, we have Aang, Katara, Toph, and Sokka, all of whom are somewhat flawed, some more than others, but are all good, caring, considerate people who improve through their interactions with each other and their interactions with the people they try to help throughout their journeys, and they become more insightful, more worldly, and more considerate people who are able to more effectively mature to the point that they're able to put their good intentions into good action without hurting others. Zuko fundamentally starts off as someone who is on the wrong side of things, but who is on that side for reasons that are understandable, if not necessarily justifiable morally, and he demonstrates signs of compassion and thoughtfulness and consideration. It is just all chained to a corrupt worldview. And steadily he travels, gains experience, directly experiences the sufferings of others who have been hurt by the forces that he has defended, the forces whose grand proclamations of righteousness he thoroughly believed, and he begins to change his mind. Once he finally has what he wants, he has reached such a point in his life that He views the Fire Nation itself and its imperial authority as fundamentally hollow and illegitimate, so he cannot really enjoy himself because he views the place that he has returned to in the right hand of his father as fundamentally illegitimate and corrupt. As such, he changes his mind and joins Team Avatar. All that is perfectly normal, sensible, heroic storytelling. That's not to say it's basic or that it's vapid. It's not. It's very well done. It's very established in real pathos and thoughtfulness and emotionality. But there's a sense of normalcy to it. There's a sense of this is how things should be. And the same is true with the villains. No one is going to cry for Admiral Zhao. He is not particularly sympathetic. We do not have any reason to really care about him as a human being. He is overwhelmed by his arrogance and his conceitedness, both of which largely exist to contrast him with Zuko, who, despite being on the wrong side of things as well, is fundamentally a considerate and dignified and honorable person. Zhao falls victim to his ambitions and loses. Ozai is also not sympathetic. He is a character of pure malice and destruction. No one is particularly upset or disconcerted when he loses and is thrown in jail at the end. I doubt anyone except Aang would have complained had he been killed. But then there's Azula. She is in this interesting liminal state. She fundamentally has a sense of self that is firm to the point of being sterile and rigid. She completely believes in her own righteousness. She completely believes in the righteousness of the Fire Nation cause. And she refuses to engage with the perspectives of those she encounters in the world. Unlike Zuko, she refuses to consider the validity of any perspectives that conflict with hers. And this narrow, shallow perspective inevitably fails her, and she does not have any basis to rely upon. For her, who lacks resilience, who has never had to develop the capacity to question or to endure, she has no solid psychological ground on which to base her self-image anymore. She devoted herself to the idea that fear and rigid control of others is important and it will succeed. When it doesn't succeed, when people choose affection and tenderness over brutal, iron-fisted authority, she is not just disappointed, she is completely perplexed. She has no one, and her entire moral system seems foolish. She has nowhere to turn. I think about this in terms of the thought of Jung. Jung is a very smart person, and it's not his fault that, like Nietzsche, his supporters are not exactly the best at grasping the subtleties of his ideas. Jung fundamentally views the self, the ego, one's conception of oneself, let's say, as a struggle against the unconscious. the world of the mothers, as Jung calls it, the night world of generation, of everything being linked together that we inevitably come from. This is a space where everything is united, everything is mixed together. It's a space of birth and generation, but also the space of mystery, uncertainty, destruction. The individual ultimately tries to form a conception of oneself against this night world, this world of the unconscious. And this is good for Jung. This is necessary. One needs to develop a conception of oneself. One needs to have a sense of ambition, a sense of drive, a sense of purpose outside of not only one's literal mother, but one's own society, one's own upbringing, the beliefs and order of the world in which one was raised. But ultimately, this can become too rigid. The self-concept can become shallow, it can become desiccated, it can become narrow, completely rejecting any interaction with conceptions of the world outside itself. And so it inevitably is disappointed by a world that does not reflect those same biases, those same narrow, inevitably incomplete worldviews. When this happens, the self must delve back into this primordial ooze of a sense, the space of questioning, the space of generation, the space of the world beyond the self, the world from which everything inevitably comes, the world of the unconscious, the world that is always there behind our actions, our conceptions of ourselves, our basic ideas of who we are and what we want. Delving into this night world, this is what Jung calls the night sea journey, is fundamentally essential. It revitalizes and restores the self, because it forces the self to fundamentally comprehend that the conception it has of itself is fundamentally rigid and fundamentally incomplete. That the world is more complicated than it had initially perceived, and that there are elements within one's own psyche that are unexplored and undiscovered, and that what one thinks of as the opposite of the self, completely antagonistic to the goals and values of the self, is ultimately on this deeper level fundamentally united with the self. The self thus gains knowledge and gains a greater and deeper understanding of itself and the world through this journey, and emerges on the other side of the journey as a nourished, revitalized, and wiser individual. But there is a great risk to this journey, and that's what I think of in terms of Azula. When you plunge into this world, it is a sense of backwardness. It's a sense of going back to the source, going back to the womb, going back to the sea, going back to the unconscious. All of these are united for Jung. It is a sense of willfully abandoning one's sense of self. And if one does not have the willpower to forge a complete and reformed sense of self in opposition to the sense of destruction, the sense of complete dissolution, this realization that one's conception of the self is inevitably limited and shallow and incomplete, then one's basic ego is completely shattered, and one has no sense of self anymore. This is the risk that these kinds of journeys inevitably include. Jung is very aware of this. And Azula does not complete her journey, unlike Zuko. She does not have the endurance, she does not have the insight or the capacity to effectively critique the belief systems she has held. She feels their inadequacy, but she does not know why. She is not willing to understand the truthfulness and the validity of concepts that she has rejected. For Zuko, this is a hard journey, but he is used to a kind of suffering. As he says, he's had to struggle and fight, and that's what makes him who he is. Azula has never had to do that, and so she completely collapses. And yet this doesn't feel grand. It doesn't feel like a beautiful triumph. Quite the opposite. It feels sad, and I appreciate how Avatar: The Last Airbender as a show is mature enough to grasp the sorrow and the lamentation of Azula's final downfall. She is still a child. She is still Zuko's sister. And as importantly, she is not completely incapable of consideration, of thoughtfulness. Her journey would not have registered nearly as powerfully as it does. Her end would not have been as truly tragic as it is had we not had the beach. The beach is the episode that transforms her from a villain that we might find cool or stylish or daring, but is not someone we deeply care about on an emotional level. And we see that she's a real person. She's a bit awkward and clumsy, but that only increases her relatability in a way. She cannot connect with other people. She cannot understand other people, but she tries. She really, at least for a bit there, tries. She does not want to just be Azula, the imperious Fire Nation princess all the time. She expresses an interest in trying on new perspectives, on new identities, on new masks, in the same way that Zuko does. And yet it doesn't work for her. And she's left feeling more self-conscious and more vulnerable than ever. We see that she is so dependent on this conception of herself as this powerful ruler who controls others through force, and that without that she doesn't have anything. Azula without her title and without her basic confidence in the validity of ruling through domineering force is nothing. And so when she loses her friends, when she loses her belief in the values to which she had committed herself, she is nothing. She completely dissolves into this primordial sea that Jung describes. Primordial sea from which we all come. And that's compelling. It's a bit disconcerting in a show that otherwise makes sure to have a compelling, reassuring, satisfying ending. It's the one aspect of the show where you don't get the reassurance that everything is absolutely alright, and that's interesting, and I think that's why people keep returning to Azula. So thank you all for watching. If you liked what you saw today, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Go to my Patreon if you can, and you want to see more videos like this before anyone else. I know I talked a lot about Jung today. I'm sorry if that lost anyone. But what he says is seriously interesting, and try not to be put off by a lot of what people say about Jung as being like very rigid and deterministic about things. He's really not, if you get into what he actually says. But anyway, tune in soon for our next analysis. We'll be coming soon. Promise you that. Thank you all again. Adios, comrades.